In part 1 of our Ned Kelly series, we explored his early life, the struggles of his family, and the challenges that shaped his future. We looked at his run-ins with the law, the harsh realities of life on the frontier, and the tensions between selectors and authorities. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, we recommend doing so before continuing, as it sets the stage for what follows. Now, let's delve deeper into the unfolding events that would cement Ned Kelly's place in Australian history. In 1864, the Kelly family moved to Avenel, a small township on the banks of Hughes Creek, about 75 kilometers north of Beveridge. Established in 1849, Avenel was a thriving rural community and an important stopover on the busy overland mail route between Melbourne and Sydney. One of its most enduring landmarks, the Avenel Stone Bridge, was built in 1859 and still stands today, just as it did when a young Ned Kelly called this town home. The creek and the settlement itself bore the name of English squatter Henry Kent Hughes, who was among the first European settlers in the area. His vast property, spanning 62,000 acres, was also called Avenel. It was here that Ned's father, Red Kelly, leased a 40-acre farm for £14 a year, hoping to establish a dairy herd. At the time of the Kellys' arrival, Avenel was a modest township with around 30 houses. The Kelly children attended Avenel Common School, a simple slab-walled structure with a bark roof, established in 1856 near Hughes Creek. Ned and his sister Margaret were enrolled here from 1864 to 1865. In 1865, School Inspector Wilson Brown recorded young Edward Kelly, then a student of the 4th standard, as having passed in reading, writing, and arithmetic. The original school building no longer exists, but the institution evolved into what is now Avenel Primary School, officially renamed in 1970. While the Kellys tried to make a fresh start in Avenel, Red Kelly was gaining a reputation as the village drunkard. Meanwhile, in 1865, Ellen's father, James Quinn, sold his property at Wallan and purchased the 20,000-acre Glenmore Run on the King River for £2,000. Following him were Ellen's sisters, Kate and Jane, who moved with their husbands, the Lloyd brothers, to Greta, near the Glenmore Run. Though Red and Ellen struggled financially in Avenel, their family continued to grow, and by mid-1865, Ellen was pregnant with their 7th child. That same year, a desperate decision would land Red Kelly in prison for the first time in 2 decades. A calf from the nearby property of the Morgan brothers wandered onto Red's patch. Temptation got the better of him. He slaughtered the calf and hid its skin in his bedroom. When the Morgans reported the missing animal, a police search led to the discovery of the hide in Red's home. Charged with receiving a stolen hide, he was unable to pay the £25 fine and was sentenced to 6 months hard labour. He spent 4 months in the Avenel lockup before being released to his family. While he was in custody, Ellen gave birth to their daughter, Grace. Amid these hardships, young Ned Kelly had his first brush with public recognition, not as an outlaw, but as a hero. In 1865, he bravely rescued 7-year-old Richard Shelton from drowning in the shallow but swift waters of Hughes Creek. As a token of gratitude, the Shelton family presented him with a 7-foot-long green silk sash. This prized possession would resurface many years later at Ned's last stand in Glenrowan. The sash, remarkably preserved, is now on display at the Benalla Costume and Pioneer Museum. Even decades later, Ned Kelly's act of bravery in rescuing Richard Shelton was remembered. In 2001, The Age published an article titled, "Ned Kelly Saved Our Drowning Dad: The Softer Side of Old Buckethead," in which Richard Shelton's sons, Harold and Britton, both in their 90s, shared their father's brief, but telling words about Ned. Though he never elaborated on the story, whenever asked about Ned Kelly, he would simply say, he was all right. But for Ellen Kelly, life remained a relentless struggle. Around this time, the name of her 5-year-old son, Dan, appeared in the Victoria Police Gazette as a suspect in the theft of a horse taken to Glenmore Station. In reality, it was likely Ned, who had used his younger brother's name when dealing with police. a habit that would continue in later years. Before we move forward, we must first look back to Ireland, where the seeds of Ned Kelly's defiance were sown long before he was born. To truly understand what shaped Edward Kelly into the infamous outlaw history remembers, we need to explore the struggles of the Irish settlers who came to Victoria. Their deep-rooted resentment toward British rule wasn't just about the present, it was inherited from generations of hardship, injustice, and survival. Their fight didn't end when they left Ireland, it simply found a new battleground in Australia. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 had left a lasting scar. Over 1 million Irish people perished from starvation and disease, while another million were forced to flee. Despite the suffering, British authorities continued to export Irish grain and livestock to England, prioritizing profit over human lives. The famine wasn't just a tragedy, it was a betrayal. On top of this, the Irish had endured generations of brutal land policies, where absentee British landlords charged exorbitant rents and evicted families who couldn't pay. These forced evictions, often carried out with ruthless efficiency, left thousands destitute and fueled a burning resentment toward British rule. When Irish settlers arrived in Australia, they found that history was repeating itself. The colonial authorities, many of British descent, viewed the Irish as troublemakers, treating them with suspicion and enforcing laws that seemed designed to keep them at a disadvantage. For families like the Kellys, this wasn't just history, it was their daily reality. They faced relentless police harassment, unfair treatment in the courts, and a land system that made it nearly impossible for struggling settlers to get ahead. Ned Kelly grew up hearing stories of injustice and witnessing firsthand how the law was used to protect the wealthy while punishing the poor. To the Irish settlers, the battle against British rule didn't end in Ireland, it had simply moved to Australia. This is the world that shaped Ned Kelly, the world that turned him into a symbol of defiance. Whether he was a hero or a criminal depends on who tells the story, but one thing is certain, for many Irish Australians, his fight wasn't just personal. It was part of a much larger struggle, one that had begun long before he was born. In December 1866, Red Kelly's drinking landed him in trouble once again. He was fined for being drunk and disorderly. But this time, the effects of alcoholism took a fatal toll. Just 2 days after Christmas, he died at Avenel. As the eldest son, young Ned was the one who signed his father's death certificate. Red Kelly was laid to rest in Avenel Cemetery, leaving behind Ellen, a widow at 34, with 7 children, all under the age of 13. In 1867, a few months after Red Kelly's death, Ellen found herself in trouble with the law. Ending up in court on 2 separate occasions, charged with assault and abusive language. One instance she was brought before the court for fighting with her sister-in-law, and Ryan. In another occasion it was with pig farmer, Thomas Ford. Ellen was found guilty, and was charged with 40 shillings fine or 7 days detention. 2 local businessmen paid her fine and gave sureties that she would keep peace. It wasn't long before Ellen made the decision to leave Avenel and relocate her family to Greta to live near her close relatives. A decision that would later make her 2 children declared outlaws in the future. A report was filed at Avenel by a local named Michael Kelly claiming that Ned Kelly had stolen one of his mares. The Police Gazette mentioned that Edward Kelly had taken it with their family on their journey to Violet Town. While no warrant was ever issued, the following month's Police Gazette referred to Edward Kelly as being charged with horse stealing. But the charges were not pursued. The following year, the Kelly family embarked on a 130-kilometre journey north along Sydney Road, settling in Greta, near Ellen's family. The move brought them closer to the Quinns and their relatives by marriage, the Lloyds. Ellen's sisters, Kate and Jane, were already living in Greta, but when Ellen and her children arrived, both of their husbands were in Beechworth jail, convicted of cattle theft. A grim introduction to their new surroundings. The family's troubles continued. In 1868, Ned's uncle, Jim Kelly, was convicted of arson after a violent dispute with Ellen. In a fit of rage, he set fire to the rented premises where the Kellys and some of the Lloyds were staying. Initially sentenced to death, his punishment was later reduced to 15 years of hard labor. One thing was clear: Ellen's children were not headed for a conventional upbringing. Greta was a struggling pastoral settlement, home to subsistence farmers eking out a living with a few cows and little promise for the future. The Kellys leased an 88-acre plot with a small hut at 11 Mile Creek for 2 shillings per acre per year. The land was poor for farming, and to make ends meet, Ellen took in travellers and sold sly grog, an illegal but lucrative trade in the bush. In 1869, at just 14 years old, Ned Kelly met Irish-born Harry Power, a notorious bushranger, who had escaped from Melbourne's Pentridge prison. Power had befriended Jack and Tom Lloyd while in prison, and after his escape, he used the Quinns Glenmore property as a hideout. By May 1869, Ned had become Power's bushranging protégé. Already harboring a deep resentment toward the Victorian legal system, young Ned was captivated by Power's tales of outwitting the police, stories that only reinforced his growing defiance of authority. That same month, Ned Kelly and Harry Power attempted to steal horses from Mount Battery Station, owned by squatter John Rowe. Their plan was to use the horses in a daring robbery of the Woods Point Mansfield Gold Escort. However, the scheme fell apart when Rowe fired shots at them, forcing them to abandon their plan. Following this close call, Ned temporarily distanced himself from Power. In police records, Power's young accomplice was listed as Lake, a prisoner already in jail for illegally using a horse, an alias that worked in Ned's favor by keeping his name off official reports. Ned's first documented brush with the law came in October 1869. A Chinese hawker named Afuk reported that as he passed the Kelly home, a young man, whom he identified as Ned, brandished a long stick, declared himself a bushranger, and robbed him of 10 shillings. Arrested and charged with highway robbery, Ned insisted that Afuk had insulted him and his sister Annie during a dispute over a request for water. The Kelly family testified in Ned's defense, and despite the local newspaper stating that Afuk's account seemed more believable, the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. This pattern, accusations against Ned Kelly followed by a lack of legal proof, would be seen time and again throughout his life. By March 1870, Ned and Power had reconciled, and over the following months, they embarked on a series of armed robberies. In April, they held up a herdsman named Johann Murray near Cainton, their second robbery that month. Murray later gave a detailed description of Power's young accomplice, describing him as in his 20s, about 5 feet 9 or 10 inches tall, light build, sallow complexion, smooth face, surly appearance, wearing a dark coat, hat, and dirty moleskin or tweed trousers. Sergeant Whelan, who had developed a reputation as an authority on the Kelly family, was convinced the description matched Ned. However, at just 14 years old, he was significantly younger than Murray's estimate, an indication of how quickly the young bushranger was becoming entangled in a life of crime. When Ned returned home after his bushranging exploits, the police were waiting. Hoping to capture both Harry Power and his young accomplice, they surrounded the Kelly homestead, only to find that Power was nowhere to be seen. Disappointed but determined, they arrested Ned and took him to the Benalla Police Court, where he was remanded in custody. The Benalla Ensign and Farmers and Squatters Journal reported on the arrest with a telling remark: "Power's cub has been taken, though the old fox has up to the recent managed to escape." At just 14 years old, Ned was already seen as a criminal in the making. Police Superintendent Charles Hope urged him to consider leaving behind the bad influences of Greta for honest work as a shearer in New South Wales, but Ned's fate rested in the courtroom. He faced 3 robbery charges, but in each case, the victims failed to identify him. Despite this, Superintendents Nicholas and Hare pushed for a trial, arguing that he closely resembled the suspect described by the victims. Meanwhile, police had another opportunity to strike at Power. Jack Lloyd, recently released from Kilmore Jail, was given a choice: either serve a long sentence alongside his 12-year-old son Tom, or assist the police in capturing power in exchange for a substantial reward. Jack ultimately chose self-preservation, striking a deal that would see the authorities go easy on Ned in return for his cooperation. With little evidence against him and witnesses allegedly intimidated into silence, Ned was released after a month in custody. Another point of confusion may have played in his favor. Some reports described Power's accomplice as a half-caste, but the police dismissed this as a result of Ned's unwashed appearance after weeks in the bush. Notably, despite their suspicions, the authorities treated Ned relatively well, believing that, at just 15, he was still young enough to be reformed. But as history would show, Ned had already set foot on a path from which there was no turning back. Harry Power often sought refuge at Glenmore Station on the King River, a property owned by Ned Kelly's maternal grandfather, James Quinn. It was a familiar and seemingly safe hideout, but in June 1870, Power's luck ran out. While resting in a mountainside bark shelter overlooking the property, he was captured by police. Almost immediately, whispers of betrayal began to spread. The Argus and Benalla ensigns speculated that Ned had sold Power out, an accusation that cast a dark shadow over him. Desperate to clear his name, Ned wrote to Sergeant James Babington of Cainton, the only surviving letter in his handwriting, pleading for help, saying, "Everyone looks on me like a black snake." Harry Power, in conversation with the vagabond, at Pentridge, stigmatized Edward Kelly as cowardly and bloodthirsty, and said that he was afraid to perform the simple act of holding his horse outside the Seymour Bank, as he proposed, while he went in and robbed it. He also stated that he once prevented Kelly from shooting a harmless traveler on the road between Benalla and Mansfield, out of mere devilment. As history would reveal, the real informant was Ned's uncle, Jack Lloyd, who received £500 for helping police track down Power. However, some evidence suggests that Ned, too, may have provided information, likely in exchange for the charges against him being dropped. Power himself never forgave Ned or the Quinns, believing he had been betrayed. Power's arrest marked a turning point. The Argus ominously warned of what was to come. The effect of his example has already been to draw one young fellow into the open vortex of crime, and unless his career is speedily cut short, young Kelly will blossom into a declared enemy of society. It would not take long for that prophecy to be fulfilled. In October 1870, a dispute between a hawker named Jeremiah McCormick and Ben Gould, a friend of the Kelly family, took a nasty turn. McCormick accused Gould of stealing his horse, prompting Gould to retaliate with a crude joke. He sent McCormick's wife an indecent note along with a parcel containing calves' testicles. Ned Kelly, caught up in the mischief, helped deliver the parcel. When McCormick later confronted Ned over his involvement, the argument quickly escalated, and Ned punched him. Arrested for both the assault and his role in delivering the offensive note, Ned was sentenced to 3 months hard labor for each charge, and sent to Beechworth Jail. Grantley Chiesa, in his book Mrs. Kelly, vividly describes Ned's arrival at Beechworth on the 11th of November, 1870. Ned is marched into Beechworth Jail, a high-walled and turreted citadel, quarried from the granite of its 4-acre site, high above the springtime foliage of the pretty little gold mining town. Ellen's Sunshine has exactly 10 years to live. He is unaware of that, but nerves play hell on him anyway. The local press was unsympathetic, branding Ned a young scoundrel, and arguing that 25 or 50 lashes would be more efficacious in deterring such as Kelly from crime than a sentence of 2 or even 4 years imprisonment. Despite this harsh rhetoric, Ned was released 5 weeks early, on the 27th of March, 1871, and returned to Greta. However, trouble soon found him again. Shortly after his release, horsebreaker Isaiah Wild Wright rode into town on a horse he claimed to have borrowed. He had come to the Kellys' home to meet Alex Gunn. That night, the horse disappeared. While Wright was away searching for it, Ned found the missing horse and took it to Wangaratta, where he stayed for 4 days. Unbeknownst to him, the horse actually belonged to George Newland, the Mansfield postmaster. On the 20th of April, 1871, as Ned rode back into Greta, he was intercepted by Constable Edward Hall, who suspected the horse was stolen. Hall had a reputation within the Victorian police force, regarded as intelligent, active, and zealous by his superiors, but also known for his violent tendencies and a history of perjury. What followed would be one of the most infamous encounters in Ned Kelly's early life. Ned Kelly did not go quietly when Constable Edward Hall attempted to arrest him on suspicion of horse theft. He resisted fiercely, overpowering Hall despite the constable's repeated attempts to shoot him. It was only with the help of bystanders that Kelly was eventually subdued. However, Hall, seething with anger, brutally pistol-whipped him until his head was described as a mass of raw and bleeding flesh. Initially charged with horse stealing, Ned's charge was later downgraded to feloniously receiving a horse, for which he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Isaiah Wilde Wright, the man responsible for bringing the horse to Greta in the first place, received just 18 months, while Alex Gunn, convicted of horse theft, was sentenced to 3 years. Ned served his sentence at Beechworth Jail, Pentridge Prison, and later aboard the prison hulk Sacramento, moored off Williamstown. There, he was put to work at the Point Gellibrand Quarry, a site now mentioned at the Williamstown Coastal Heritage Park. The labor at Point Gellibrand was far harsher than at Beechworth, with prison wardens enforcing strict discipline. On the 2nd of February, 1874, Kelly was released 6 months early for good behavior and returned to Greta. According to one possibly apocryphal story, he immediately sought to settle the score with Isaiah Wright, the man whose carelessness had landed him in prison for 3 years. It is said that Ned challenged Isaiah Wright to a bare-knuckle boxing match at the Imperial Hotel in Beechworth and beat him soundly. Wright, however, had only served 6 months of his 18-month sentence and had since married Bridget Lloyd, the eldest sister of Tom Lloyd. Whether or not the fight actually took place, Wright later became a known Kelly sympathizer. A well-known photograph of Ned in a boxing stance is often linked to this alleged match. Returning home was not a joyous occasion for Ned. 2 of his siblings were missing. His elder sister, Annie, had died in November 1872 while giving birth to her second child. Her death filled Ned with fury, particularly towards Constable Ernest Flood. Flood, a married man, had seduced Annie by buying her a dress while her husband, Alex Gunn, was still in prison. Meanwhile, Ned's younger brother, Jim, had also fallen into trouble. At just 14 years old, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for stealing and selling cattle. What angered Ned most was that the man who had received the stolen cattle, James Dixon, a former 2-time mayor of Wangaratta, was not even charged. To Ned, this was yet another example of police persecution against his family, a belief that would only deepen in the years to come. In the years following his release from prison, Ned Kelly drifted between jobs, working at sawmills and spending time in New South Wales, where he embraced what he later described as the life of a rambling gambler. Meanwhile, his mother, Ellen Kelly, remarried. At 43 years old, she wed 23-year-old American George King. Just 2 weeks after Ned's release, he stood alongside Bill Skillion as a witness at their wedding, which took place at the home of Reverend William Gould of the Primitive Methodist Church in Benalla. By early 1877, Ned had joined his mother's new husband, George King, in an organized horse theft operation that extended across Victoria and New South Wales. According to Ned's later claims, the group had stolen as many as 280 horses, a large-scale operation that was both lucrative and dangerous. Their activities soon overlapped with the Greta mob, a gang of young larrikins known for their bold and flashy dress. Among their ranks were several figures who would soon play key roles in Ned's story: his younger brother Dan, cousins Jack and Tom Lloyd, and the men who would later become the core of the Kelly gang: Joe Byrne, Steve Hart, and Aaron Sherritt. The stage was set for one of the most infamous chapters in Australian history. The Kelly gang was born. As the dust settles on the fiery events of Ned Kelly's rebellion, we are left with a tale that is as tragic as it is legendary. From daring escapes to gunfights that shook the nation, Ned's journey is far from over. But what truly sealed his fate? What led to his final stand in the ironclad armor that would etch his name into history forever? The answers lie ahead. Stay tuned for Part 3, where we unravel the dramatic showdown at Glenrowan, the relentless police pursuit, and the final moments of Australia's most infamous outlaw. The legend is about to reach its climax, don't miss it.